Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. It's Fran here, and I'm back with my Gameweek 14 team selection. Now, if you had watched my Gameweek 13 review, you would actually have known what transfer I made this week. It was very simply put going to be a Chelsea defender. The decision was either between James and Alonso, and I'll probably briefly elaborate on why I've picked with James. It wasn't necessarily a knee-jerk decision. It was something that I had basically been thinking about quite deeply after the Chelsea game versus United, where they managed to secure a draw. The issue for me with Alonso is not the fact that I think he will haul less than James versus Watford. In fact, I think it's the opposite. I think Alonso might have a higher chance to haul versus Watford. I expect that he plays. What Alonso has going for him is I think Tuchel doesn't really have many options in this kind of left wing back position. And we've seen players like Pulisic play there, but no one has really interested in that role. And I think that's why there's such a glaring hole there since Chilwell has gone. And Alonso clearly has taken a step back in terms of his performances. I think he'll also struggle quite a bit at his age playing consecutive games. So maybe Tuchel will change something about that. That's my hope, at least. I don't have Alonso currently also just because he just didn't interest me from a footballing point of view in terms of how he was contributing in open play. Now, he took a lot of set pieces, which will inevitably inflate his expected assists. It will also inevitably create goals over this course of this December run, where I'm sure players like Rudiger, Thiago Silva, or Christensen will find their way to getting a set piece goal. But Alonso just didn't interest me in terms of open play. One part of that, of course, was playing versus Aaron Wan-Bissaka, who's a fantastic defender. But another part of that was just a lack of decisiveness in open play. He really wasn't creating too many chances, in my opinion. Yes, he was actually making good runs, but ultimately you have to deliver those kind of crosses, which is something that James has been able to do over the course of his tenure and this kind of fantastic run that he's had, where a lot of people think that he's emerged as basically one of the top two world-class right backs in the world. When I look at James, I think on the other side of this Chelsea fullback kind of look, I think with James, for me, he is someone who, when you look statistically, he actually leads or is within the top three in the league in terms of creating assists. A lot of people think that he's overinflated his goals tally, that he scored too many, and that he will actually, and you'll find that his kind of goal tally will regress. But I actually don't think that's an issue. When I was actually looking at efficiency of Chelsea defenders, we were saying that they're 2 to 3 times more efficient than some of the other forwards in the league, and more than 2 times more effective than some of the best midfielders in the league in terms of value for money. And I just think that James is that kind of piece where if you're going to go through a 3-back formation, he's clearly the one you pick over Alonso. Alonso might have better short-term dividends, but as a season keeper and someone in a position that you don't really want to change for the remainder of the year, unless, God forbid, another injury happens, James is the one that you'd like to pick. And I'm still at a crossroads where, especially since an option like Lamptey is so interesting at this point in time, playing so offensively in his right wing back position for Brighton, I think there's still a possibility where you play a 4-back, but maybe you don't have to expunge that much money into someone like Alonso. Hey guys, just before we continue with the video, I'd love to shout out OneFootball. They're a fantastic football app that you can actually use to stay in track with all your football news, all your football preferences, all in one place. The beauty of the app is that you can basically subscribe to notifications for any specific team you'd like to follow, any specific league you'd like to follow, or you can actually keep it simple, keep it very private, and make sure that you turn on the app whenever you want, and keep it quiet like that. For me, I actually like to use the app when I'm basically outside of the house or just trying to check up on games, maybe to see what kind of lineups are posted, what kind of press conferences I might have missed, any kind of recaps for games, any previews for games as well, with kind of written commentary on that sort of thing, and also kind of journalistic takes on football as well, all surmised into one place. Personally, for me, I also like to follow the European leagues, try to see what's going on with the midweek games on the kind of app, and also stay in track of the international events, like for example the World Cup qualifiers that just passed in the last international break. Hope you guys check out the app in the link in the description below. I will still keep an eye out for Alonso. I think clearly when you look at the fixtures, it makes sense to look at Alonso, especially after the West Ham game. That run between Leeds and kind of Brighton is going to be a fantastic run if you own a Chelsea defender, and I'm sure and I'm definitely going to be looking at maybe, let's say, moving away from some of the forwards into another defender or another midfielder, depending on the situation. I think when you look at my defense this week, I've decided to field Trent. I think it's very self-explanatory in a sense, and maybe there's actually a situation where I would like to captain Trent. I think Everton, we've seen, pose absolutely no threats from an offensive point of view. They haven't really scored in the last few matches, and we know this Liverpool team can keep clean sheets quite easily and quite comfortably. We've also seen Trent do fantastically in terms of hauls. I expect that he will have a good game, and Salah in a sense has trended a little bit further down. He has gotten a few assists in the last few weeks, but the goal scoring tally has dried up just a little bit. Whereas I think with Trent, you have that security in a sense playing versus Everton, and they're very, very poor attack at this point in time, and maybe it makes sense to go for Trent. But the issue, of course, is it's a derby and you don't know what can happen. I think Everton have actually been doing quite well over the last few years playing at home versus Liverpool, and that's my one concern there in terms of captaining a Liverpool player. I play Cancelo. I think he's a very obvious choice. Now, he is one actually yellow card away from suspension, but I think I have a strong enough bench at this point in time where I can maybe consider, or maybe just be happy to have him be on the bench. I don't think many people still have Diaz. I think the Diaz ownership has clearly dried down in the last few weeks, and I'm sure a lot of people have continuously made moves away to someone like James from Diaz, just due to the fact that unfortunately we saw Man City lose their clean sheet versus a fantastic Lanzini strike. Cody is someone who features again. I spoke about Wolves briefly in the sense that I wasn't very interested in their defensive displays, or rather I think that they were kind of overselling their clean sheets, right? They're actually allowing the enemy teams that they're playing to create a lot of chances, and they've kind of been, in a sense, getting away with it. And for me, I do think that Cody will still have a good game. It's a good hedge versus Cornet, and you'll see, of course, that some of my decisions were more centered around Rafinha or Tony, which I'll discuss in a brief second when I look at my midfield. For me, Coney is just that kind of asset where I would like to see probably Coney for the last time, at least in terms of my starting 11 this week. I think Burnley getting to play at home in Molineux is going to be a nice game for Wolves, and hopefully they can repeat the performance that they provided versus West Ham and secure a clean sheet once again, just like they did versus Norwich. They haven't been too interesting from an offensive point of view, which is why I'm quite happy to not own a Wolves forward at this point in time. But Cody is definitely someone who I think is still a lock for me in this game week. We saw the 2 bonus points come out for him, and I think that just comes down to their play style. They are allowing a lot of attacks and allowing the enemy team to build quite a few chances. Not necessarily crucial big impact chances, but definitely they have been giving up a lot of position and space versus their opponents and losing in terms of possession. We saw that, for example, I think in the Southampton game, which was another picture perfect example of what kind of culminates in a Wolves clean sheet. James, as I said, is a clear lock. He plays this week. My hope, of course, is that he doesn't make this kind of cameo for 1 point, and in the worst case where, let's say, James doesn't play for 90 minutes, someone can come off from my bench, one of Tony or Rafinha. We move on to the midfield now. You'll actually notice that I have decided to play Rafinha. The toss-up was between him and Tony. Leeds have been markedly quite poor this season. I don't think that they've met the intensity last year where they were able to actually dominate most teams in terms of the press, get a lot of possession of the ball, and actually kind of push very high up into the field and create a lot of chances through crosses and plays where they're able to cut inside from the kind of wing positions. This year, I think, especially since a lot of the athletes have had a lot more rest, we've seen people match the intensity of Leeds and actually surpass it, in my opinion. And we've seen Leeds crumple as well in the second half, after showing maybe what would be a good first half. A good example of that would be the Tottenham game. We've also seen other instances of that in other times this season, such as the West Ham game. For me, with Leeds, I think clearly Rafinha is still the best player. They're very reliant on him in terms of chance creation and goal creation, but they just have looked overall extremely poor. The issue, of course, is that Tony, on the other hand, hasn't looked that interesting, even though he's actually scored 2 goals back-to-back. We saw him score a penalty versus Everton, which is exactly why, we mentioned that he would be a better asset than Mbeumo, probably, if you had to pick between one of the Brentford assets, and he's delivered very faithfully in the last 2 weeks. The issue with Tony, I think, is playing this Tottenham side. We know Tottenham are going to be rested. They are playing at home, so Brentford are going to be playing away. And Tony, if you actually look at the Everton game, he didn't really get any effective shots on target, bar the penalty, and that kind of tells me that there aren't going to be many great chances for Tony anyways when he's playing away from home. And that's kind of my big fear. I think that Rafinha probably has slightly more chances. Even if we're talking about, let's say, a clean sheet, I'm going to get more points from Rafinha at the very, very worst case scenario. That's why Tony sits on the bench for me, and Rafinha is someone who plays in the midfield for me this weekend. Jota is a no-brainer. Salah is a no-brainer. I think obviously we'll be expecting some kind of discussion on captaincies. But let's just talk about Cornet very quickly. Cornet is someone I'd love to have on my team. He's someone I brought in the previous week. Very unfortunate once again due to the suspension of the game. Unfortunately, there's nothing you can do from that. You just have to move on, really. The game should probably be rescheduled for game week 21, something like that, in a double game week. but we're not going to get any benefits from that because a lot of people can get Cornet at that point in time if they're actually interested. And, we've ultimately just missed a game, unfortunately. With Cornet, I think in this fixture, yes, they're playing at Wolves and Wolves are playing at home. But I still think this Burnley team have been able to crumple some of these mid-table sides and actually score a multitude of goals. We've seen that versus Brentford. We saw that versus Crystal Palace. Those sides that I'd say we expect to be quite decent from a defensive point of view. But Burnley were able to score 3 versus both, or even 4, I think, versus Brentford. And that's kind of my main reason for picking Cornet, even though I have Cody as a defender. Yes, it's kind of a hedging in a sense where hopefully Cornet holds and Cody suffers because of it. But I'm not that interested in Tony. I think it could go either way where Wolves, for some reason, have been able to shut out some of the better sides in the league in terms of creating chances this season. And my opinion on Burnley is that they're also able to explode versus teams, which I'd be happy to see, to be honest, even if I was playing Cody. It's a bit of a weird matchup. Clearly, Tony is on the bench, and that's a question mark, but it's a decision that I'm happy to do because I think James probably won't play and Tony might come on regardless. And I didn't really want to do anything in terms of this game week in terms of any kind of extravagant kind of hits. There's no reason to really do that, and that's why I've gone for Cornet in this team. The captaincy was actually an interesting choice. I think that my captaincy might actually stay on Salah. That's pretty much where I'm trending to right now. I think the other options for me are going to be Trent and Kane. Trent is interesting because, as I mentioned, Everton just haven't been interesting whatsoever from an attacking point of view. And that's a really good reason to just put the armband on Trent if I'm pretty happy that they're going to get a clean sheet. My reminder, in a sense, is going to be that Man City game versus Everton, where they had a very comfortable 3-0 victory, and Everton provided nothing because they're still missing Dominic Calvert-Lewin, still have some key injuries in the squad and things like that. So Trent might actually find his way with the armband. Salah is probably going to be the most logical choice for most people. He's continued to get contributions over the last 2 weeks, but not at the kind of explosive rate that we saw, between that kind of Man United game and the games previous to that. So for me, one of the question marks, of course, is going to be, can Kane make sense as a captaincy option? When you look at the forwards now, he's someone who actually gets the rest. He didn't get to play the game versus Burnley, and he's playing at home, probably after a very extensive training regimen with Conte, and perhaps the side is going to find itself fit. The issue for me still, though, is that turnaround from some of the previous kind of games that they've had just doesn't seem to be relied upon, right? I can't imagine that a team that can lose in the European Conference League, that can secure draws versus Everton without scoring a goal, that can just barely edge its way versus Leeds, will ultimately win versus or score largely versus Brentford. Yes, Brentford have been destroyed a couple times this season. We've seen kind of market collapse from them, but I think Tottenham just haven't provided enough. When you look at overall the kind of expected goals that Tottenham have provided this season, of course, it's not really the fault of Conte specifically, but just over the course of the tenure of Nuno, as an example, you'll see that they've created only 13 XG, whereas Liverpool have created something north of 34, which is almost 3 times realistically what Tottenham have provided. And I just think my chances are better with either a Liverpool asset, that being Salah or Trent. And so my armband is probably going to go for Salah for now, just to play it safe. But if I'm feeling a little bit risky in the morning, I think I might actually switch it to Trent. But we'll see what happens there. As I mentioned, though, of course, Everton have had a relatively good record versus Liverpool, and I know people are going to mention that Everton aren't in good form, and you also kind of have to factor in things like that. But I do think in derbies we've seen teams kind of pull out performances, and we know Everton always try to give their best versus Liverpool, given the kind of importance of this derby in this game, and we saw that last year as well, where tensions were extremely high in a 2-2 draw, I believe. And so for me, when I look at it, I think it's probably the safest option to go with Salah. Nothing more there. If we actually talk about the rest of the forwards, I think it's quite obvious why I've picked Antonio. I just think that even though he's not in the best of form, and I've dropped someone who's actually scored 2 games in a row in Tony onto the bench, I just feel like Antonio is someone who can contribute versus this Brighton team. They're playing at home at the very least, and they're coming off a game versus Man City where the momentum in a sense is with them because they scored at the tail end of the game. And I think they expected to kind of hit this fixture run and be dealt a very bad hand. But West Ham are still doing quite well in terms of where they're sitting in the table. And I don't think this Brighton side have been that interesting overall from a defensive point of view. We've seen a lot of slip ups from players like Sanchez. We've seen quite a bit of change and rotation with the kind of back line. And for me, Antonio can hopefully seize on that and do well today. So that's kind of my expectations there and why I've started Antonio over someone like Tony. But overall, I think the situation is, let's say, even if James gets rested, Tony probably comes in. And even still, I think there are a couple players with arguably poor fixtures this week, and I'm still happy to keep them as things stand. Either way, I hope you guys have a wonderful week ahead, and hope you guys get a much better game week than I did in the previous, and take care.